Hello learners, welcome to this another session of Certificate in Fashion Design program. So today's topic of discussion is on plain seam and its finishes. So this is one of the activity of course 2, which is basics of pattern making and sewing. So we have already discussed about seams and different types of seams. We have discussed about machine, its setting up of the machine, different parts of the machine. We have discussed different types of stitches also, which all activity you might have performed. So today in this session we will discuss about plain seam and its finishes, what plain seam is and what finishing methods or neatening types we should use to get our garment finished. So today we will be discussing plain seam and its method of construction, how the plain seam is constructed, and various methods are there for finishing the seam. So what are the different types of method is used, or different construction method is used for finishing the seam we have developed on a garment. So the activity 10, this is the activity 10 of your practical manual of this particular course, that is basics of pattern making and sewing, and it is named as samples of plain seams and its finishing. So when we go for the stitching, there are different types. As we till now we have gone an idea that stitching is that the process of joining two pieces of fabric together, whether it is hand stitching or machine stitching. So when we join two pieces together, the process we do is called as the seam, and it creates we have different types of seams we use for different types of fabric. It depends upon the type of fabric, it depends upon the type of design or garment we are constructing. So what type of seam we should use for what type of fabric, it should be selected very wisely. Then in this activity we will talk about the plain seam, and when we construct a plain seam, we just see if we do a normal stitching on a neckline, if we are creating a garment. So if we do a plain seam stitch on a neckline or a armhole, the edges are not finished, so we cannot leave that edges like that. So for neatening or finishing of that neckline or the particular seam area what we have stitched, so we need some type of finishing, or the methods are there to get it finished. So when you will attempt this activity, what you will gain, you will develop samples of plain seam. So you will be able to develop samples of plain seam, and with following the right construction techniques of developing a plain seam, and you will know different various methods of finishing the plain seams. So first let us talk about what all materials you need or required when you perform this particular activity of developing a plain seam and its finishes. So first, in this activity we required the single needle lock stitch machine. You need a good understanding and control of the sewing machine. So in the earlier two activities, which was based on the sewing machine and its handling parts and its safety measures, and then handling the control on the sewing machine, you have gained a proper knowledge or good understanding about the parts and handling and control or the speed of the machine. Then you should have a good control on the speed of the machine to perform this activity, and ability to stitch straight line, angles and curves. You should be able to do perform these activities very good. Then you can perform or develop a plain seam or any kind of seam very easily. You should have a muslin or a cotton fabric for developing a sample. You should have a sewing kit, which is very important, including all the materials which is required for stitching purpose, and an electric iron to get a finished fabric. So all these basic materials are required when you perform this particular activity. Then first of all, we will discuss about the plain seam. So this is, as you can see in the picture, plain seam. It seems just like a simple running stitch. So simple running stitch with the machine, and stitch and seam we have discussed in the last session, that there is a difference between a seam and a stitch. So we are discussing about a plain seam. So a row of stitches is said as a seam. So this is how plain seam looks like. So this is most basic and commonly used seam that is used to join two layers of material together. So basic what we start with stitching a garment with is the plain seam. Then it can be used on all types of garment and all types of fabric. So when we talk about the plain seam, it is the basic seam which is we generally use to combine or join two layers of fabric, and it is one of the seam which we can use on each type of fabric or each type of garment we want to construct. Then the plain seam can have varying seam allowances. So seam allowance can vary according to the garment's need, and it is the easiest seam we can develop. It can be used on both straight and curves line. If we want to do stitching on the straight line, we can use the plain seam. If we want to stitch the curves line, you can use the plain seam on the curve line also. So this is one of the most important and basic stitch seam we use on the garments. Then what step we should follow to construct a plain seam? So first step what we should follow is if we have two layers of fabric and we place both the layers of the fabric together, one on the top of the other with their right side facing each other. Like if we have two pieces of the fabric, one will be the wrong side and one part will be the right side. So what we have to do, if we have the two layers of fabric, we have to keep the layers of two fabrics together, one on the top, and what we have to do, we have to keep the fabric with the right side facing together or facing each other and the wrong side out. It means that we have to do the stitching on the wrong side, not on the right side of the fabric. So one edge should be the aligned, and in the step 2 what we have to do, they are held together with a row of stitch at the fixed seam allowance. So suppose we have two pieces of the fabric, we have developed a pattern of a shirt, we have the front part of the shirt and we have the back part of the shirt. We just join the two pieces together and we decide at what seam allowance we have to stitch the particular garment, and after deciding the seam allowance, we just do a simple plain stitch at a particular decided allowance and at the edge of that particular garment. Then after sewing, seam allowance may be pressed, opened and turned towards one end. What we do, after sewing, seam allowance may be pressed, opened and turned towards one side. They need to be finished by any one of the method of seam neatening described, what we will describe later. So we have stitched, like suppose we have done a plain seam on the side part of the shirt, and what we do, we just opened that fabric and we just pressed, and this seam is very perfect there. And what next step we can do, we can finish the to look it more beautiful, what we can do, we need to finish that edges or the side part with using any one type of the seam neatening method, so to get it more finished and neat. Then in this picture you can see how what we were describing, that we have two layers of fabric's right side is inside and outside is wrong side is the outside. So we decided a seam allowance. You can see the mark on the fabric. Seam allowance, we decided let it be ½ inch or the 1 centimeter, and we do the stitching leaving the seam allowance, and we get the fabric joined together. Then what all process, what is seam neatening or finishing we say. So the seam edge of a plain seam are raw and they fray. So what if you see in the picture, if we have done the stitching, which is plain stitch we did, and we leave it like that only, we do not do any seam finishing or neatening, we do not do, what will happen, the fabrics have so the fray or the edges of the fabric will come out after some time. So this will what we have after, if it comes out very frequently, we will not have the fabric at its proper position. So what we do the seam neatening or the seam finishing for that. So they have to be neatened to prevent from the fraying during the use. If we do not neat the seam when we use or when we wear the garment, it will just, the threads will be coming out. So to provide strength to the seam and look neat from inside the garment, we do the seam neatening process. So various methods of neatening the raw edges of the plain seam are there. So there are 5 methods what we do use for the seam neatening. First is the turn and stitch edges, stitch and pinked edges, overlocking and binding. So first let us talk about the turn and stitched edges. This is the most common we have generally did. If we have done stitching, we do, but it is named as the turn and stitched edges. So it is also called as the tailored edge. When you see, if you have any tailored made garment or you have any garment which you got stitched by a tailor, so at the seam allowance of the plain seam is first pressed, opened, and then individually finished by this method. What it is done in the first step, what is done, we have the fabric joined with a plain seam, then it is opened and then turning of the edge. If we have the edge, as you can see in the picture, we are talking like the seam allowance part, that is said as the edge. So the turning of the edge is done and fold in 0.5 centimeter of seam allowance along each raw edges. So we fold the seam allowance what we have left the seam allowance, we just turned it and we fold it, and edge stitching is done. What we do, we do just fold it and do the edge stitching. Then press and stitch along 0.2 centimeter of the edge of the fold. Like if we have 0.5 centimeter of seam allowance left on the edges, what we do, we stitch 0.2 centimeter of the edge, we fold and we do stitching of that particular edge. This is called the turn and stitch edges. So you can see in the picture, this is how turn and stitch edges is done. Then stitched and pinked edges. So stitched and pinked edges, it is done with a when we developed a plain seam, the raw edges of the plain seam may be pinked. So pinked, how we do, there is a scissor which is named as pinking shear. So as you have seen many times on your garment, this type of structure at the edges. So there is a particular type of scissor is there which is used to do the pinking on the fabric. So the raw edges of the plain seam may be pinked. This is a seam finish in which a row of stitching is done at a distance of 0.5 centimeter from the raw edges. Like if we have the allowance of 1 centimeter or 2 centimeter, what we do from 0.5 centimeter from the raw edges, we do the pinked process. We do the edge are then trimmed with the pinking shear to get it zigzag or a pinked edges. So when we got a zigzag edges, it is not that much frayed as if it is left straight. So the stitch line helps to minimize the fraying and prevent seam from curling, and it is used for the thick firmly woven fabric that fray slightly or do not fray. So this process, that is stitched and pinked edges, we generally use for the thick or the woven fabric we generally use, which do not fray very easily. So this is how the pinking shear or the pinked and stitched fabric is finishing is look like. Then the third is the overlocking. Overlocking we also see when you have the tailored garment. You can see the overlocking process or finishing is done at the side seam part or the armhole part. You can see this finishing is done. So it is used to finish the raw edges of seam allowance. It is especially useful for the heavy weight coarse fabric. Like if we have the fabric which is heavy weight, so for that type of fabric we use the overlocking finishing method. And for example, we have the tweed fabric, we use the overlocking method. So an overlock machine, there is a particular type of machine we use for the overlocking finishes. So an overlocking machine trims the edges of the fabric and stitches by forming a loop. So you can see in the picture that we have developed a type of loop at the edge of the fabric. So forming a loop of threads which enhance the edge of the material and evenly and neat to prevent from the fraying. So this is one of the process which is used for neatening or finishing of the edge or the seam we have done. Then we have also used the biased binding. So bias binding is something, bias we have discussed in the earlier session. It is a fabric which is cut at 45° of angle. It is said as the bias fabric or bias grain. So what bias binding is about, let us know. So this seam edge gives a very neat and well finished appearance. So this is when we use the bias binding, it gives a very well finished appearance on the garment. So it is suitable for finishing seams of unlined jacket or coats we use or the formal wear. So when we use, you generally see these finishing are used on your formal wears or the jacket you use or the coat we wear. So it is used for edge neatening or for decorative purpose. We also use for decorative purpose. You usually see it is a type of extra fabric we used for neatening of the fabric. As you can see in the picture, like when you have a tailored made kurta or a shirt, we have on the neckline we have of different colors of strip we have. It is said as the bias binding. So it is used for the edge neatening or for decorative purpose. So this cost of production is very high, because if we are using different fabric or strips of fabric on for the neatening of a seam. So it cost of the production is very high, as it is very time consuming and extra bias fabric is used. So it is little cost effective, but it enhances the cost, but the finish we get of the garment is very good. So the method of construction we discussed. So stitch, what we do, as you just see in the picture, that we have our garment and we have a strip, a bias strip with us. So what we do, we stitch a plain seam, press it open and finish the edges with a bias strip. Take a bias strip of 3 centimeter width. Like if we have the fabric strip, it should be around 3 centimeter width. Fold the 0.75 centimeter from both the edges. What we do, we have a long strip. What we do, we fold the 0.5 centimeter from both the edges and press a crease on the center. Then what we do, fold the strip in such a way that the lower fold is 0.2 and more than the upper fold. This is how we create the bias strip. Then what we do, we place the seam edges between the folded bias binding. Like if suppose we have a flat bias strip, we fold 2 edges inside facing to each other, and what we do, we place the seam edge between the folded bias binding and stitch close to edge to top fold of the bias strip, holding the lower fold of the bias strip in the place as you stitch along. So this is how we get this type of finishing with the bias strip on the garment. Then there is another bias binding method we use. It is said as the Hong Kong bound. So this seam finish looks similar to the bias binding only, but it is less bulky as compared to the bias bound finishes. So this is less bulky and it is very thin, like a pipe like structure, or a very thin binding we get on the garment. So the method of construction what we use, we cut 3 centimeter wide bias strip. For a lightweight fabric like silk or organza we just cut a bias strip of 3 centimeter and we stitch a straight line, keeping the right side together the bias strip and edge of seam allowance. And 0.5 centimeter allowance from the raw edges. What we do, if we have the neckline, we have finished the neckline or the armhole, what we do, we have a bias strip of 3 centimeter width and we keep the bias strip at the edge of the neckline and we just do the stitching from that part. So what we do, we turn all seam allowance towards the bias strip and iron. We do the ironing and fold the width of the bias strip according to the width of the seam allowance which is under the below, and give sink stitch or a groove machine from the side which has a strip attached. So we use the trim that unfinished edges of bias strip. Repeat the process for the other side. Because the bias strip does not fray, the binding will not reveal even when the edges are left unfolded. If we do not fold the edges, seam edges, it will not fray because the bias binding we have used, because if the fabric is cut on the bias, so it does not, the threads does not get out from that layer. So this method of edge neating is commonly used on the neckline and the armhole. So in the picture you can see Hong Kong bounding, bias binding is used on the neckline or on the armhole purpose, and it is also used for the decorative purpose, like if we have a garment of a plain fabric or a plain color, single color, we use the bias binding or that Hong Kong binding of the different or a printed color we use. So this is also used for the finishing purpose, for the beautification purpose on the garment. So this was all about in this session. we discussed about the plain seam and its construction method, how plain seam is developed on the garment, which is it is used on every type of fabric, on every type of garment, which is the most common seam we use for in our garment construction. Then we discussed and explained the method of finishing of plain seam. So there are different methods, various method we use for the neatening of the seam edges, in which we discussed about the overlocking method, in which we discussed about the turn and stitched method, overlocking and binding, in which discussed about the bias binding and Hong Kong binding. So hope when you perform this activity yourself, you will get more clarity in how the binding or how the finishing you will do, how you will develop the seams by your own, using all the construction method, following all the steps which are discussed in here. So you will when you follow all the steps, you can get good samples developed. So hope this session was informative for you. Thank you.